Hello everybody and welcome back. In this Docker series, we are going to now go into Docker Compose. So let's get to it. The next piece that I'm going to do is I'm going to add in volumes. Now volumes is also set up as a list. So it's another indentation with a dash in the front. And here I'll list the volume that I want to start as from my host to my container, just as we did when we learned the Docker run statement in previous videos that you can go back and watch if you haven't yet. But in this case, I'm going to actually introduce something a little bit different. Instead of doing a bind mount, which is what we've been doing in the past, I'm going to do just a regular volume mount, which is a Docker version of volumes. There are some key advantages to using the Docker volumes versus a bind mount, and those could include things like they're a lot easier to migrate from system to system. You can control them through the Docker CLI versus the API. You can attach drivers to them so that you can store it in the cloud, and they also offer a more stable and safer way to share your volumes between containers. So we'll be doing that here in this build out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down below my services and I'm going to create volumes. And in here, I'm going to double space and I'm going to define my volumes. And these will be my Docker volumes again versus a bind mount. So I have to give it a name instead of giving it a location. So the first volume I'm going to create, we'll just call it WordPress volume or just WordPress. And we're going to give it a colon. And then the second volume that we're going to create is going to be the MySQL volume, which in here, since the MySQL volume is going to be for WordPress, I'm going to say WordPress DB and call it the WordPress DB volume. So now that we have our volumes defined, we can come back up here to our services under our WordPress service, and we can do very similar to a bind mount. We're going to do our source, which is going to be the WordPress volume with a colon, and then the destination, which is your standard Apache, because this WordPress is running under an Apache server, which is var www.html. So now anything that happens within the HTML directory will be saved in a volume underneath the Docker engine on our host system. Next up, we're going to put our volume in for our database. So we're going to say volumes. We're only going to have one volume, and our source is going to be WordPress DB, and our destination is going to be varlib MySQL. So now WordPress DB volume will be attached to this varlib MySQL volume, which will hold all of our pertinent database content and persist that. And our WordPress HTML directory is also persisting. Now we have one more element to add to this, and that is we want to add the WordPress user information, the database passwords, and all of that sort of information. Now, one thing that I'll stress here is, again, as I stated in the Dockerfile best practices video, we don't want to have passwords in clear text inside our environments. What we really want to do is we want to have these inputted from some sort of security system dynamically. However, for ease of this video and the fact that this is not anything that I'm worried about getting hacked, because it's going to be gone sooner than later and it's not exposed to the internet except for through this video, I'm going to enter in the environment variables that are required to make both my database service and my WordPress service work properly. And this will be that power of environment variables that we've learned in the past being put to good use here. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say environment. And you might guess that this is going to be a list, but in this particular case, it's not. It's just going to be actual key pair values for our environment variable and its value. So the first one is all capitals, WordPress underscore db underscore host. Now this is going to be where is the host container that's going to be my database. So that will be the name of the service that we're using, and this is not going to be in capitals, database. So I'm getting that from here in this database service. So our next environment variable is going to be WordPress DB user. And we're going to give our WordPress a username that we'll utilize later. And for this, I'm just going to say WordPress admin. It's an arbitrary name that I made up. We also want a WordPress DB password. So this is going to be the password that we're going to associate with the user to access our database. So we now have our host name, which is our service for our database. We have our user, and we're going to have a password, which here, once again, I can't stress enough, make sure that these are not clear text. But for educational purposes, I'm using clear text. So I'm just going to make up any kind of password here. I'm just kind of just throwing out things. And there. So we have a nice semi-secure password that is just a random password. We want to give our WordPress service the name of the database that we want to connect to. So we're going to call it WordPress-DB. I didn't want to give it the same name as our volume, just to make it so that it's not confusing at all. So we're now done with the environment variables for our WordPress container. Next up, we're going to do our environment variables for our database container. So in here, I'll go ahead and put it above and we have now environment. And in here, we're going to place the environment variables double-spaced in a key value pairs, what's required for our MySQL database service container or microservice to work. So the first one is MySQL underscore database. And here, this is going to be the name of the database that we're going to be utilizing for this entire application. Up here, I already determined what my database name is going to be, so we need to match that. Next, we need a MySQL user, which I'm going to give it the same name as I gave it up here, so that when I connect from the WordPress to the database, because each of these services need to have the same username, because I'm defining the username in my database, but declaring what that username is in my WordPress service. So the same will go for the MySQL password. Again, they need to be the same because I'm declaring it here and then I'm accessing it here. And I'm going to add one more MySQL environment variable for security purposes. And this is MySQL random password root password 1. By setting this MySQL random root password to 1, what's going to happen is when the container starts up, it's going to randomly create a root password. Each time the container restarts, that password will change, add a little bit of security to our service. If we truly needed to get into this container with the root later on, maybe we're going to access it through a PHPmyadmin container service. We can go into the Docker logs, and the random password is printed to the standard out when the container comes up. So let's add one more service just for completeness. And it's going to be PHPmyadmin. Now what PHPmyadmin is it's a utility, a tool that allows us to access our MySQL database backend with a nice user interface. That's been around for a while and I like it and I use it a lot. So I want to add it into this application of ours, and this will give us 3 services, 3 containers, and make a nice complete example. So the image here that I'm going to use is PHPmyadmin, and it's 5.1.1-Apache. Now again, I'm using a tag to keep it at best practice. The next element is the restart. We're going to say always, just like as we did up here. And actually, we did not have it, we forgot to put it in here, so let's do that now. So restart always, because we want this application to stay up. We don't want it to come down. Now this service is going to require us to publish ports. So I'm going to choose 8090 to go to port 80. Now up here, we said 8080, so I just decided to jump up 10. And for 8090, we'll be able to access our PHPmyadmin container. We need some environment variables. And this is just one environment variable called PMA underscore arbitrary. So this is just a simple variable that tells the PHPmyadmin that only one random database is allowed to connect at a time. Okay, so I think we're done. I'm going to save this out. And let's go back up and go over this one more time. So we set a version for versioning purposes. We defined our services section where we have a WordPress service, a database service, and a PHPmyadmin service. In the WordPress, we have our image. We're going to restart it always. We set up our database criteria and credentials. We published our port so we can access it. And we set up our volume to persist our data. In our database, we did the same thing, chose our base image. We're going to restart it always. We set up our database credentials and we assigned our volume so that we can persist our data. And then finally, we added a service type sidecar container that will allow us to access our database backend if we need to, utilizing the PHPmyadmin container. That's going to also restart always, and it's going to be published on port 8090 to our 80 on our container. And then at the way bottom, we defined 2 Docker volumes to hold that data that we connect to through our containers. So I think this is a good stopping point so that the video doesn't get too long. In the next video, we'll deploy our application locally and see how everything works and see all the components working together. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.